Energy Media readers, on Monday, Prime Minister Trudeau announced the bridge financing program for large Canadian companies. And of course, that includes oil and gas companies. And a key, we'll call it a string, was attached in that those companies must report on climate risk, and they must have a plan to get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is Canada's official objective. And so to talk with me about that is Professor George Hoberg from the University of British Columbia. Welcome to the interview, George.
Hi there, it's good to be here.
Now, give me your response to the announcement on Monday.
Well, I'm very pleased that the Trudeau government is taking climate so seriously. I do think, though, that these strings are potentially limited in their efficacy if our concern is driving down emissions and actually meeting that net zero target as a country. Because what the requirement does is it requires disclosure of financial information and various plans. It does not require any specific climate action on the part of any large polluters.
My take on what he said was that there had to be some kind of plan that was consistent with Canada's national climate goals. I interpreted that to mean that he expected these companies to come forward with a plan, but you didn't read it that way?
What does that mean for each individual company? Let's pick on one, Suncor, which actually is one of the corporations that already complies with the climate disclosure circumstances, right? Suncor's emissions are going up, and Suncor's climate disclosure plan says that their goal is to reduce emission intensity, not to reduce emissions. And maybe by 2050, they have to reduce or eliminate emissions or get to net zero, but that's so far distant that it's not really a very good guidance at this time. That's one concern, is the distant horizon. The other is the collective action nature of it. Any one individual firm or polluter says, well, I can keep polluting because everyone else should reduce. And then even if not everyone else reduces, I can find an offset or something somewhere to help with the net zero stuff. Unless you have a jurisdiction-wide cap that's being driven down, there's no actual force behind a requirement like this. That doesn't mean it's without effect. It can still have effect because it's a signal to the international financing community about what this particular company's plans are. And that they may be punished by the finance community concerned about climate risk to either assets or the risk of future climate policy. And so it may steer investment away from those companies and incentivize their behavior that way. But that's a different mechanism than a government requirement that emissions be reduced. Here, the government requirement is only disclosure, not pollution reduction.
Yeah, and already I've talked to some people in the industry in Calgary, and they're talking about how this particular program, as one person put it, has holes in it you could drive a truck through. As you say, there's no firm requirement. So if the Trudeau government was going to take the next step, what kind of a program would you like to see implemented?
Well, it's not a program around disclosure. The disclosure rules are a good idea,
right,
because the signal they sent to the investment community. What Canada needs is a plan to get to net zero by 2050. So that requires a whole bunch of things that we haven't even begun to think about yet. But right now, we have a system that relies on individual provinces developing their own plans without any firm overall reduction target for the country. The only thing that is across the country is the floor on pricing, right? Everyone has to have some kind of form of carbon pricing, but that's not a direct control on emissions per se. A completely different approach, which Canada has not pursued, but which both Quebec and Ontario were doing, is a cap and trade program. If we had a national cap and trade program, where the caps were designed to go down so that in 2050 they'd be net zero, then there'd be a very clear incentive for each jurisdiction and each individual polluter to drive their emissions down. The way we're doing things now simply does not do that.
In Alberta, where of course the oil sands are, I mean, they're 11% of national emissions. Alberta's 26% of national emissions. And I was very interested when, you know, the Kenney government came in and it replaced the NDP's somewhat tougher CCIR with the less tough TIER, the tier. And I was kind of surprised that the Liberal government signed off on that. I mean, they extracted the promise of $30 a ton instead of 20, but they still signed off on essentially a diluted plan. And that kind of sends mixed signals.
It does indeed. So, I mean, what the Trudeau government continues to do is simply put off, as the Alberta government does, the day of reckoning for how we're going to deal with oil sands emissions. And it's not actually a great time to talk about that right now, because we've got much bigger problems as a society to deal with COVID-19 going on. But when the pandemic recedes and we move on to you know, new forms of economic growth, we are going to need to have a new kind of economy that is not reliant on large carbon emitters. And that just is not something that people have felt very comfortable talking about yet. And we do need to get to that stage. This, to me, this disclosure requirement doesn't get over that hurdle. That's something that has to happen soon and in the future, but hasn't happened yet. This is just a good sign that the Trudeau government is continuing to think about climate and wants to send a signal to those major polluters that they are going to continue to think about it. And among the things they're thinking about is that the fact that Canada's policy with respect to long-term emissions is net zero by 2050. And it's a very, very harsh requirement for Alberta's oil patch.
Professor Hoberg, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. And this issue may not be top of mind during the pandemic, but it is top of mind for my readers, and I no doubt will be talking to you.
I know it is. Okay, thank you very much.
Take care.